Hello and welcome to Rails from Scratch. That's the newest name that we've come up with for our video podcast that we're doing here. I'm Brian from Oakland, California.
And Steve from Columbus, Ohio.
And we're here to learn about Rails and the web in general and Ruby and all sorts of fun things. And first off, I wanted to give a little shout out. We haven't really publicized our YouTube channel or our Google Plus page yet, but we got one subscriber to our YouTube channel, and that's Rodolfo. So welcome, Rodolfo. Good to have you. Hope you enjoy. Anybody else? We have some also views on our channel, so if anybody's watching, if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to post comments on the YouTube channel, and we'll try to respond, and we'll try to also improve the video podcast if there's any technical issues or if there's anything that seems boring or ways that you think that we could do things better. Definitely let us know because we want to make this useful for everybody. So, okay. So, anything you want to say, Steve, before we start?
No, I am just excited to learn from the master.
Great. So I can probably minimize the screen recording here. Great. So I was thinking of, we want to get back to our Rails application, but I think first it occurred to me that maybe we should cover some basic object-oriented programming first to have a basis to work on, because a lot of these things that we're talking about, there's talk of, it's good to have the concepts of classes and objects and instance and class methods and all these things. And I was explaining to Steve earlier, the concept is pretty straightforward, but it really does require some playing with it for a little while. So I'm just going to go over some, not belabor the point too much, but I want to get into some examples, and I encourage anybody watching, and of course Steve, to, when you have a little bit of time, maybe play with some things, try some things, research some things, and see what you can find out. So I think you said you also, it just occurred to me, you said you were playing a little bit earlier today. Did you have any questions that you thought of or anything, any insights?
No, not really. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, that's fine. So my first class in computer science in college, my professor told a little joke, which was that if you're ever interviewing for a programming job, and someone asks you to explain object-oriented programming, all you need to say is inheritance, and they'll be so impressed that they'll just give you the job. It's probably not exactly true, but it's sort of goes to show that inheritance is a pretty important concept in object-oriented programming. So we'll talk about that. But first, conceptually, I'm going to type Ruby code here to demonstrate. But really, I'm just trying to get some terminology out there. So you can define a class, and so let's say a pretty common example that is used that's a little bit abstract. And not necessarily usable because of that, but useful enough for explaining purposes, is to describe a zoo. So let's say that we have a zoo class, and let's say that we have an animal class. So we define those, and we'll fill these in a minute with more, but we're just getting our basic overlay of things. And then we might also have we can actually do it in a couple ways, but let's say we have a lion class, and we have a monkey class. And lions would inherit from animals. They would have the same behavior as animals, and so we would define an inheritance in that way. And so what that means is that any methods that we define on the animal class will be available when we're working with the lion class.
Okay.
So an example of that is we might have a method on the animal class called noise. So if we wanted to know what noise an animal makes, here we might actually, in the animal class, there's a couple sort of ways you can do this, but here we'd probably say raise this method must be defined by the subclass, something like that. And then we'd say def noise, lion goes rar.
Nice.
And what's that?
Nice. I think
Nice.
you might want an S in noise.
Oh, thank you. Perfect.
By the way, listeners, this is the one time I will contribute to the entire podcast. That's all I got.
We'll see about that. So noise. So for a monkey, that's ooh, 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 ah, ah.
Nice.
Maybe we won't define an exclamation point in here because if we're calling this method, a reason we might want to call this method is to, maybe we're putting on a web page the noise that's being made for the particular animal that you're looking at.
Okay.
And so we're calling this method to get that. And so we can also do things like we can say def breathes, maybe. I'm trying to think, breathes. And we could return true as sort of a Boolean out of that. And then we wouldn't have to define that on the lion class. This is assuming like all animals breathe.
Sure.
So that's maybe we could further use inheritance by. Let me see if I guess it's possible to make. Yeah, can you still read that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we could have like, for example, but maybe not all animals breathe. So we could have a feline class that inherits from animal, and then lion would make that inherit from feline. And we could go crazy, especially with animal classifications. But we could have a primate class, which inherits from animal. And actually, maybe it'd be better say a mammal. Are felines mammals? I think they are, right?
Yes.
How do you spell mammal?
M-A-M-A-L, maybe?
M-A-L. Okay, let's just say that that's the spelling for the purposes here. So let's say feline inherits from mammal. There's a class mammal. Mammals breathe. They breathe. So we say true.
I lied to you. There's two M's in the middle.
Okay, I can fix that. M. So felines and primates. So that's a feline and that's a primate. And so we can say def leg count. Let's say felines always have 4 legs, so that's the leg count. And so for lions and panthers and jaguars and all these things, we don't need to define a leg count. We can just depend on the fact that felines always have 4 legs.
Okay.
And so if we call leg count on a lion object, we're going to get it 4.
Okay.
And actually, let's do this in the Ruby console because we can define these and play with them as we go. Make this a little bit bigger. Text bigger. I always have trouble with my QWERTY keyboard figuring out how to make the text bigger. Make text bigger. Make text bigger. Can I do that? No, that's not good. I always seem to have to do this.
Nice. There we go.
Yeah, it's getting better. Okay. I also want to make sure that our viewers can read this. So
Yeah.
we have a decent size. Okay, we can go into IRB, and so we'll be in a Rails console, or in a Ruby console. Sorry.
Okay. Yep.
And we can define these classes. We're not really using the zoo at the moment, so we can sort of ignore that. And so MAMAL. And we don't, let's say all mammals breathe. I don't know if that's the case or not, but we'll say that it is. That needs to inherit from animal. And we have leg count. Let's say primates always have 2 legs. So we'll say 2, and monkeys, maybe we'll also have different sort of, is there another sort of feline, like let's say house cat. House cat.
Okay.
Which wouldn't be in a zoo, but just go with it. Feline, deaf, noise.
Oh,
Yeah.
with an S.
Thank you.
Nice.
So, right. I'll just copy all of this, and these just be some examples. So copying all that into the console. So now we have, for example, the house cat class. You can see that it's there. If I type some other class, it would say uninitialized constant some other class.
Gotcha.
So it's just letting it, when we see it returned, we see that it's there. And the thing to know about Ruby, it's a little bit strange, and I won't go into it too deeply, but like everything is a class or an object in Ruby. So it's something to keep in mind. That's not always the case with other languages. Sometimes you have these sort of primitive things, like usually they're integers and booleans and things, which work separately, and they aren't always defined in the terms of classes. But in Ruby they are. So
Okay.
So if I say housecat.new, I'll be given a housecat object. And so we'll say HC1, housecat1. Housecat1.noise is meow. So we see, like if I were to call housecat.noise, what do you think will happen?
Let's see. Would that? I don't know.
Okay, we'll find out. Undefined method.
So is it because that's not a particular house cat that we were asking about, or
Yeah, that's basically the idea. Is that we're not talking about a particular house cat. We're talking about that we're calling that method on the class.
Okay.
And so you can think of, I don't know if you've studied Pluto or Plato, not Pluto, the dog, or the former planet.
Former planet or Pluto.
But Plato, the philosopher, he has this sort of idea that there exists in the ether this perfect concept of a table, or this perfect concept of whatever.
In this case, a perfect house cat that doesn't make your house smell.
Well, that would be nice. Yeah, exactly.
The idealized house cat.
We have to implement a non-smelly house cat as a sort of implementation detail.
Nice.
So, so that's sort of the idea. A class is the Platonic ideal is a philosophical term, but really it's the idea of a house cat, but it's not a particular house cat.
Okay.
That's the way you can sort of think of it, and that's where the first explanation sort of ends, and where playing around with it actually gives you this sort of concrete ideas. But for now, I think that'll serve that a class is a general idea of something.
Okay.
And we can also say, for example, we can also define class methods on classes, and those are things that you can call on classes. That's why they're called class methods and instance methods, because HC1 is an instance of the housecat class, whereas the housecat class is a class. It's the general idea. So you can define methods on both of those things to be used in different circumstances. So what I want to do is I want to say def name. It's actually, in Ruby you can say attribute accessor, say name, and we'll copy this class definition again so that we'll override what we got. And so now all animal classes, really all instances of animal classes, will respond to name. So if I say house cat dot, or sorry, hc1 dot name, it doesn't have a name yet. If I were to call something else, foo,
Okay.
undefined method. So by doing this attr accessor name, I'm defining a method. I'm actually defining two methods. The other one is name equals, and so I can say Felix. So now if I say hc1.name, I've got Felix as the name, whereas before when I called that it was nil,
Okay.
which is nil is sort of means unknown. It's the default
Yeah.
value for a lot of things. And so I can actually show, like, the attr accessor is sort of the same thing as saying name, and we have what's called an instance variable
Hmm.
in here. And so if I said name equals new name, name equals new name. So this is in object-oriented programming, especially in traditionally, historically, this pattern is pretty common. They're called getter and setter methods.
Hmm.
And this name method, it's really all it's doing is it's returning the value of the name instance variable. You can see because there's an @ symbol here, that means it's an instance variable.
Okay.
And this one is just setting the value of name. Does that make
So
sense? Go ahead.
maybe. So for example, you come up with a new cat,
Mm-hmm.
HC2 or whatever,
Yeah, let's do that.
and you do HC2 dot name. Is it going to just say new name instead of nil?
It's going to say nil. Well,
Okay.
first off, I haven't defined these methods, but these methods do exactly what this does. So
Hmm.
I was just using these as sort of a demonstration about how this is a much better way to go about doing this.
Okay.
FYI, there's also two other things that you can call attribute reader name and attribute writer name,
Hmm.
and those individually define these methods. The reader will define this method name, and the writer will define the name equals method. But having accessor means it defines both methods. And so this housecat2 name, if I call it, I get nil.
Okay.
But if I set the name to something else, hc2 dot name equals Jimmy. Now hc2 has the name Jimmy, hc1 has the name Felix.
Okay.
So that's why that's kind of why I wanted to write these methods out, is because
Mhm.
essentially what we're working with when we're defining these attr accessor is we're working with instance variables, which are variables that are stored inside of an instance of a class. And so for the house cat, the variable name, there's two different name variables that are being stored inside of hc1 and hc2.
So there are two different. How is that?
So I mean, there's each one has a name variable. Is maybe a
Okay.
better way to explain it.
Oh, I get you. Okay.
And so they're independent of each other. They don't affect each other.
Hmm.
And really, anything that you do with an instance of an object doesn't affect any other instances of the object,
That makes sense. Yeah.
unless you like pass in another instance of the object or do something specifically to bring that other object into play.
So if we say hc1 dot name equals hc2 dot name or something like that.
Yeah, we could totally do that. And now hc1.name is Jimmy.
Okay.
hc2.name is Jimmy.
Now, okay. Now, by the way, is that when we did that, does that link those two, or is that just at the instance that at the like moment in time that we did that, it redefined HC1, and then if we change HC2, HC1 stays the same?
So that's a really good question. There's some cases where that actually does happen.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that we've basically made a copy of the Jimmy string and assigned it to both, like independently.
Okay. Yeah.
So if we said hc2 dot name equals Steve, then hc1.name is still Jimmy.
Okay.
There are some objects that, like if you were to assign an array or a hash to the instance variable, if you were to change, like for an example, if you had an array assigned to it, and then you were to change one element inside the array, like, and you'd done the same thing, like if you said, so if what would a feline or a house cat have as an array?
I don't know, a list of toys, maybe?
Toys, sure. So house cat, adder, accessor, toys, and so copy that. Okay, hc1 toys, and so, and also notice in some languages you have to define what you're going to be assigning to variables. Like this is going to be an array or this is going to be a string. But in Ruby, it doesn't really matter. You could assign whatever you want to any variable.
Okay.
I'm going to close my window here. There we go. So if I say toys and then we say some string, I say ball of string, and a cloth mouse. hc2.toys is nothing. Say we assign hc1.toys to hc2.toys, and now both of them have the same stuff.
Yeah.
But if I were to say hc1.toys, and I add on, this is the operator, by the way, for adding something onto the end of an array.
Oh, nice.
So we say it's another toy that a cat could have. Little ribbon. What's that?
Catnip.
Catnip. So now we've added catnip onto hc1.toys. hc2.toys also has catnip.
Ah.
Because and so this is just sort of a gotcha that you want to understand. It's not too important, I think, for the moment, but when you assign an array from one variable to another variable, it's storing it in the same place in memory. It's referring to the same place in memory. And so if you add something to the array or if you change something in the array, both of them are still going to be referring to the same array.
Interesting. Okay.
So the way to sort of fix that is to say hc2.toys equals hc1.toys.dupe.
Dupe. Okay.
Which means you're duplicating the array.
Okay.
And so now if I say, so first off I see hc2.toys, hc1.toys, they have the same content, but now if I say hc1.toys, we add on ribbon.
Good idea.
hc2.toys, see now they're different.
Okay.
And the reason is because hc1.toys.object_id, hc2.toys, they have different object IDs now.
Oh.
Whereas before
okay.
they had the same object ID.
Interesting.
And that's actually a reference. I just learned this recently. That's actually a reference to the object's place in memory.
Oh, okay.
So, just a fun fact.
Oh, neat.
So but that's not so much about object-oriented programming. That's just about variables in Ruby, which is certainly useful. Go ahead.
No, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually another. So something that just occurred to me is like if we wanted to define a class method for a house cat, we could say usable toys, and here we could just return a value out of here, kind of like we're doing with the thing. So we could say that usable toys mean this is sort of, we would define this, and this would be the entire set of toys that we could assign to toys, to the individual instances. So if I said, say available toys, maybe that's a better way to say it. Available toys. Okay. and say housecat dot available toys. And so now we have that array. But if we say hc1 dot available toys, it's not a method because it's a class method. And I sort of skipped over this, but the way you define one of the ways you define class methods is by saying self dot in the declaration.
Okay.
You see that?
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, again, this is all sort of abstract and sort of these weird examples that you wouldn't necessarily, if you were working at a Fortune 500 company, you're probably not going to be defining these classes anywhere. They're not, they're not practical in that way. But the way there's nothing. I should also say there's nothing really magical about defining this method. Like I can still, at the moment, I can say that HC1's toys. I can make that list of toys anything I want. A car, cat. I didn't meant to say car, but and so creating this available toys method is not limiting me in any way unless I specifically go in and make it limit me.
Okay.
So and at that point I would have to specifically define a toys. Here I could define like a toy attribute reader for toys, and then I could define toys equals as a method. New toys. And say something like if the intersection of the new toys and available. You got a phone call?
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right.
This might be the only phone in our house that doesn't have a way to turn off the radio. All right. Well, problem solved. There we go.
Awesome. So, toys equals new toys. So I could define this method. This is not something we have to worry about too much for the moment, but basically what it's doing is it's checking to see if the new toys array that's being passed in has actually that's not the way to do it. I say if available toys, and you subtract out new toys, if there's any left. So basically, if there's, new toys minus available toys. This will basically tell us if there's any objects in the new toys array that aren't in the available toys array, then we'd raise an error. Otherwise, we say, okay, yeah, we can assign that variable to the instance variable.
Okay.
So we could add a check in there if we wanted to, but that just make things more complicated in some ways. So I think that roughly covers the notion of classes and objects in object-oriented programming. Is there anything that doesn't seem clear? Because it totally could be.
Yeah. Well, honestly, so could we go over that whole adder accessor thing one more time? Yeah, I saw that there were the two different kind of methods that it was handling for you. I don't think I'm necessarily following that still.
Right. Totally. So if you ignore the adder accessor for the moment,
Yep.
You could pretend like we defined these two methods,
Okay.
def name and def name equals. And name equals is a little bit special in Ruby. Normally methods, when you call them on objects, there needs to be no spaces.
Yeah.
But if you define a method that ends in equals, you can have animal.name. So hc.name space equals. You don't have to have the space. You can say that equals Jack. Either way. But essentially what you're doing when you're saying name equals is that you're passing in, you're calling the name equals method, and you're passing it this value. You'd actually do it this way too. And so that's maybe a little bit clearer that we're calling a method called name equals.
Wait a minute. So name equals is the method.
Name equals is the method, right? There's two methods, name and name equals.
Oh,
And so, and that's actually, I don't know if that's too common in programming languages. But yeah, you can't have a method. I don't think it's possible to have a method that has like equals in the middle of it. I don't think that's a valid name. It's generally, and it's also wouldn't be good practice because I think it would confuse
right.
people. But it is possible to define a method where equals is at the end, and it should take an argument of something that's going to be passed in,
Yeah.
and then you can pass that in order to call that method. And here, and we can, if we wanted to, we could say puts setting new name as, and then we could concatenate these together. New name. And we make sure this is a string, so when we output it, and I messed up there. So now hc1.name name equals Brock. So now you see it outputted setting new name as Brock, and just after that, it doesn't. There's no indication of that, but just after that, it assigned what was passed in as new name to the @name variable, which is the instance variable. So if we say hc1.name, now we see that's the instance variable for the cat.
Okay. So okay. So on that second part, instead of saying name, when you define the thing as name equals, did we have to use the equals sign there? Could we have said like name update?
You could totally do that. Yeah, you can. And usually, I don't know if it's just a Ruby convention, but a lot of times you'll put the verb first. So like update name, and that we could define that exact same method.
Oh, okay.
And it would do the exact same thing. There's nothing particularly special about the equals being at the end, aside from it allowing you to say name equals blah.
Okay. And this is probably a stupid question. If we just defined that name was a thing, kind of that first little block of code there, whatever, we wouldn't have been able to say name equals, Jimmy or whatever. That's not something that Ruby inherently understands, I guess.
Yeah, like it doesn't give you those things by default. Maybe is a good way to say it.
Okay.
So let me also first off say, we should use some female names. Amy.
Nice.
So you can see.
Cats.
What's that?
We got some lady cats.
Lady cats. We don't want a cat sausage party up in here. So hc1.update name, it's same method definition inside, but we call it update name, and so now if we say hc1.name, we get Amy out. So there's nothing particularly special about that. So your question, say again.
So that first block where it says def name, @name, end. So that's kind of saying that there's this thing called name. Is that a method there that we're defining? Name
It is. Yeah, it's a method. And the other thing I realized, I talked about it yesterday, but it's a weird thing, is that Ruby by default returns the last line. I don't know if you were getting caught up on that or not.
So if you have some kind of a function or something, it's going to return the last line no matter what. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And so here, what we're returning name. These are the same. Saying return name is the same as just saying name.
Oh, okay. Nice.
And so, go ahead.
Okay. So right now we've defined this method that's called name. but we have no way to do anything with it or access it or give it a value or change it or anything until we do that next line, which is def name equals that whole thing, right?
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Okay. All right. All right.
And we could potentially have some other function, called this does crazy things. And it could do a bunch of things, but as a side effect, it may set the name equal to just some static value or whatever you wanted to set it to. But yeah, essentially, there needs to be some method on the class that sets the name. Otherwise, we can't touch it.
Okay. Now that thing you just wrote there, that this does crazy things, whatever it was. So would there be a way that we could, from the console, call that new function that you built, or do you have to define a method to allow us to call it?
Yeah, so if we go in and I've been copying this whole method definition, but let me actually do this sort of a little more slowly. If we say class animal, and then we just copy this method, because one of the things about Ruby is it lets you update class definitions as you go, which is kind of neat. So I can add this method on the fly.
Okay.
And so now I've just added the this does crazy things method to the animal class.
Okay.
And remember, it's an instance method, so we can call it now on hc1. First off, we say hc1.name, it's Amy. Now if we say hc1 dot this does crazy things, and that actually, you can see name equals returns the value that's being set.
Okay.
But it also is returning that value out of the this does crazy things. So that's why you're seeing it here, because that's the return value of this method. Because we're in the Ruby console, and so it's outputting everything that's returned from the method.
Okay.
But now if we say hc1.name, we see that the name is OAEU.
Okay. Now, is the only reason that worked was because HC1, due to inheritance, is part of this animal class?
Exactly.
Okay. So if we'd done, like car1, it wouldn't have worked.
You said car1?
Yeah.
Car1. Yeah, that's undefined local variable or method.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But I mean, if let's say we had a class called machines and car1 was part of that, then it would not have worked, right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Oh, all right.
And so, let me get rid of. So one of the nice things about inheritance means that, like, rather than having to define these name methods on lion, house cat, and monkey, and all the really base classes, we can just define it once. And if we ever have to fix it or change it, we only have it in one place. But all of these methods take advantage of the fact that it's there.
Okay.
And so by putting these name methods into the animal class, we all animals now can have a name assigned to them and changed. And also, so the maybe now that these methods are clear, the sort of nice thing about Ruby is that you can call inside of a class definition, you can say adder accessor here, and say name, and it defines these two methods for you. And so if I get rid of those, that's going to be the exact same thing.
Okay.
Which is nice. It's conceptually, it's easy to read, and it's easy to know what's going on.
Okay.
And if ever something becomes more complicated, where you have to do something more complicated to the name, like checking to make sure that the name is within a certain, matches certain rules or whatever, then you would make it a method. But this by calling adder accessor, you're essentially saying, I want to have these two methods, but I'm communicating that I'm really just creating a couple of simple methods. It's not doing anything fancy. So. Anything else?
No, I think that was my big question.
Okay, great. So yeah, object-oriented programming comes up a lot, but with Rails, like you can see, I've gone over to your screen now. It's
Yeah.
not always used in quite the same way. Whereas we're talking about animals,
Hmm.
there's this very clear definition of like what an animal is. We all know what an animal is,
Yeah.
but a controller, an application controller and a buzz controller, that's a little fuzzier, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, but you can see it's just using. There's nothing really. I mean, there's magical stuff going on, but as far as the syntax, you're just defining methods here, instance methods, new form, create, index. The only thing that's sort of weird is that you're never actually calling those methods.
Okay. So why is that?
So it's like maybe what I should say is it's not that you're never calling them. It's not that they're never being called ever.
Okay.
Like when you load a web page,
Hmm.
excuse me, they are being called. It's just that you, as the Rails programmer, are not calling them. Um, and so the reason why that is because the people that were creating Rails, when they wanted to have some structure for people to be able to put their code in,
Yeah.
all Ruby really gave to them is classes and objects, right?
Hmm.
It's at the. I mean, there's more. There's some classes and objects that Ruby already defines for you, or some classes, I should say. But that was really all they had to work with was classes and objects. So it's like, okay, let's make a controller. We're going to create these methods where people can put their code that is going to be run when someone makes a web request.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay, yeah, and it's a little bit weird, and this is why I kind of wanted to cover object orientation,
Thanks.
because the concepts I think are pretty straightforward, but they're used a little bit weird in Rails. It's actually maybe we can talk about some active record stuff, because that is a lot more concrete. You tend to define things that are you're defining things that are stored in database records, and so it tends to
Yeah.
be something that you have already made concrete.
Okay. And by the way,
Go ahead.
in this example that we have up on the page,
Uh-huh.
so I've got this class buzz controller, which is this made up thing that you and I just made up, right?
Right.
Buzz controller.
Mm-hmm.
And that's inheriting everything from a thing called application controller.
That's right.
And I'm guessing the application controller is kind of a predefined thing in this, like in Rails, or did we make that too?
No, you're absolutely right. It's defined within Rails. It's actually there's a gem. So Rails is just really a combination of different gems
Okay.
that are put together in sort of a clever way. It's sort of a framework that you can work from, and so there's a gem, I believe, called Action Controller that this stuff comes from. You can think of it as just coming from Rails for the moment, because it really is all just Rails is defining all this stuff that you can use.
Yeah.
And so application controller does define this stuff in the background where you can define whatever methods you want, and it takes care of hooking up. We were doing routes last week, and it takes care of getting a request in, parsing a route, and then calling the right method inside of this controller that you've defined, and then finding and rendering a view, which is the other sort of layer, and then sending that back, and it sort of all does that for you. And so what's nice is you just have to define something very basic, saying, okay, I want to get some buzzes, and then you define a view that says, here's how I want to display them, and it takes care of all of the other framework, piping, plumbing for you.
Okay.
And you can get it more into the plumbing, but the thing that's nice about Rails is that it lets you start off at a shallow level and then work your way down as you're comfortable. And obviously, what we found out last week is that it's already relatively complicated especially if you're starting from scratch, and still learning about HTML and all these things, to get into it. So you can imagine how complicated it is if you have to worry about how to deal with taking in requests and handling them at a somewhat lower level.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So it's handling that for us, which is awesome.
Right. And actually, let me also point out something. If you change, so this application controller, I should clarify, it is actually something that's defined in our application. It was built when we created the Rails application. It was built for us. But if you go and look in the rightmost tab, there's the application controller. So that's actually what we're inheriting from. But then you can see that in turn is inheriting from action controller base. And so action controller base is actually what's defined in the action controller gem. It's where everything comes from. And application controller is there so that we can have a place to put all of the common stuff that we're using across all of our controllers.
Okay. Oh, nice.
And so right now there's not really anything there, and that's fine. But at some point, if we discover that we're doing something the same way across all of our different controllers, then we're like, oh, we should put this in the application controller.
I got you.
So, go ahead.
No, that makes sense. I got you.
Yeah. And you can see there's also a sort of a common pattern. So we have action controller base here. If you open up the Buzz model, if you go under app models,
Buzz.rb.
That's it. You can see that's inheriting from active record base.
Okay.
And actually, just as a quick note, you see the colon there.
Yeah.
That's what's called namespacing.
Oh.
And so there's actually a class called base, but it's defined within the active record module. And modules they can be used for a couple things, but in this case, it's used for what's called namespacing, which is basically you can have multiple base classes, but they're not going to interfere with each other because they're underneath different modules.
So we've got this active record module, and we could also have a cool stuff module, and both could have a thing called base. But this is, this is one instance of base, and that would be a different instance of base.
Right, and that's definitely right. And I would just pause for a minute to talk about that terminology. You say an instance of base, whereas an instance in object-oriented programming terms, an instance of a class is an object. But I know what you mean. I just pointing out
please.
it's not like you're instantiating objects. It's that you have two different class definitions in memory.
So what we did with the two cats, HC1 and HC2, were those instances?
Those were instances, yeah.
Those were instances. Okay.
Right, and you could have a house cat class, and then you could have a cool stuff : house cat class that had nothing to do with your house cat class.
Okay.
And you could have an instance of the house cat class, and you could have an instance of the cool stuff house cat class, and they'll probably behave differently because the classes are defined differently.
Okay, so I gotcha.
Cool. So, and actually you can see, I mean, we did a little bit of stuff with the Buzz class last week, and you can see here we're defining a class, and right now there's nothing defined within our Buzz class.
Okay.
Which is, this is sort of the amazing, the really, really cool thing about Rails and action controller and active record is that you define nothing or very, very little, and you get all this power. Like with the Buzz class, we could make queries to the Buzz table, get objects out and work with them, and we didn't have to do anything except define a Buzz class that inherits from active record base.
Okay, and because that functionality is in active record base, then we can do it.
Right. It's there's a concept in programming called DRY, or do not repeat yourself, or don't repeat yourself, I should say, which is basically like you should store your code in such a way that you organize your code in such a way that you're not repeating yourself and you're not having to copy and paste code.
Gotcha.
And this is sort of the ultimate example of that is like, oh, we don't, all of these programmers don't need to define how to connect to a database and how to do all this really crazy, awesome, cool stuff. We'll just put it in a class, and then they can just use our class.
Okay. Now, this is probably going to be a stupid question. So we define this class here called Buzz, and it's looking at active record base. So the things, let me see if I can find one. So this line here, where we did buzz.create, could we have just done, whatever it was, active, thing.base instead of creating a class called Buzz?
Active record base, yes. So that's a good question. And the answer is not really, because the way that active record base works, I mean, that's definitely a good question. The way that active record base works is that it introspects the name of the class that you're using. So in this case, it's the Buzz class. And it knows, okay, if you call create on the Buzz class, somewhere in the create method, probably in some function call that's going somewhere else, it's saying, what table do I need to connect to?
Okay.
And so in order to do that, it says, okay, well, what's my class? And it says, okay, well, my class is Buzz. And it'll take that class, and it's going to turn it into a string, which is going to be the string capital B, lowercase u, lowercase c, lowercase c. And then it's going to say, okay, well, hand that off to this other algorithm that knows how to turn classes into table names. And this is actually an algorithm that you have available to you. It's handy to be able to use it. But it knows how to take the B and make it not capital anymore, but make it lowercase. And then it knows how to pluralize the word. To put an S at the end of it, or if it's a special word, sometimes put an ES at the end of it, that sort of thing. Sometimes also words like sheep pluralizes to sheep. And so it has some, I don't know that it has sheep in there, but there's some cases where, it knows that a particular word doesn't have anything added onto it in order to be made plural.
Okay.
And there's a whole, I think, module dedicated to pluralizing and singularizing things.
Neat.
So when we call create, again, we're calling this method that knows how to take the Buzz class and turn it into the string buzzes, which is going to be the table that we're connecting to.
Okay.
And this comes back to another very common practice in the Ruby and Rails community is called convention over configuration. This is also the reason that the Buzz class is so empty, is that we don't need to tell it what table you're connecting to, because we're following a certain convention. And that is, we have the Buzz class, capital B, and we have the buzzes table, lowercase b, and we don't, as long as we define it that way, we don't need to say, okay, this is the table you're connecting to. It just guesses. And if that's wrong, it'll say, oh, I can't find the buzzes table, and then you might have to tell it specifically, oh, this is the table I want you to connect to, and you can do that. But generally, it's best to just say, I'm going to define the class this way, and I'm going to create a table with the name this way, and that way I don't have to worry about it.
Interesting. Okay, so we did create the table buzzes, right?
We did.
Yeah, and we did that knowing that it would know how to get to it, right?
Right, and actually, we used a generator in Rails to basically say, create a model called Buzz.
Yep.
And it created for us a migration that created the buzzes table.
Okay.
So it's even more thoughtful of them because you can just generate this and say, okay, I want to generate a new model, and it'll create a migration that creates the database tables for us, and anything, there's also tests that you can, if you want to test your model, it'll create the right files for that, and so it sort of creates everything in the right way that works with Rails, so you don't have to think about it.
Okay.
But also, it's good to know that you can just, if you wanted to, all you need to do is go into the models directory, create a new file called buzz.rb, say class buzz inherits from active record base, end, and now you've got a model. You probably also want to create a migration too that creates, and destroys the table as needed. But yeah. But you also, like, if you're creating, like, if you're working with a legacy application, like if you wanted, if you had some Java application that was working with an existing database, and you're like, well, I want to create a Rails application that connects to that database.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to worry about migrations. You just need to create your model and connect to it, and everything's great.
Interesting. Man, I'm really glad we went through the, or at least are going through the kind of object-oriented programming, not refresher course, but remedial object-oriented programming. Thank you.
Sure. No, I think it's definitely useful to know this, because it, like I say, you have to learn that stuff, and then Rails sort of turns it on. It uses it in sort of a slightly odd way. So you're highlighting this line 6, and so I'll ask you the question. We're calling the create method, and so see if you can remember how that's defined, or what that method is called.
What method is called?
Like,
I'm sorry.
what type of method is it?
The create method?
Mm-hmm. Is it an instance method or a class method?
So I'm guessing it's a class method, because it's not like, buzz.1, or I'm sorry, buzz1, it's acting on the entire buzz class. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
And it's good to think about when you define these methods, like if you were building active record yourself,
Mm-hmm.
imagine it didn't exist, and you're like, okay, I need to have a method that's going to create objects. It doesn't make sense to have that as an instance method,
Right. Yeah.
because you're not creating. You're creating an entry in the table, which is just a general thing that you do to that table. It's not something that you're doing to a particular row, because you're creating a separate row.
Right.
So that's important to think about when you're structuring code. Like, should this be a class method? Should it be an instance method? And a lot of times when you define it the right way, things sort of fall into place that way.
Okay.
So that's
Okay.
great. Go ahead. Do you have something else to say?
So just real quick,
Mm-hmm.
would there be a case kind of in that example where you might define it on an instance? Would it be kind of a one-time use thing then, or?
So there is another method in Active Record that is an instance method that does create a record. Maybe I'll ask you first. Can you think of a reason why you would call a method on an instance and have it create a row?
Create a row, huh?
And normally when you're creating an instance method, you need the data in that instance for some reason or another. That's a good way to think about it, I think.
Okay, so.
And actually, just something else that just occurred to me. A lot of times, I've seen people create class methods, and they'll pass in an instance of that class.
Okay.
And that's a lot of times, most of the time, that means you need an instance method, because really, an instance method is a method where the first argument is the object itself. Sort of one way to think about it. Because you're saying, for this object, I need that object to operate and do what I need to do.
Um, yeah, I'm kind of striking out here, man. I don't know.
Sure, that's fine. I thought I'd check, but it's not necessarily an easy question. So there is a method in Active Record called clone,
Okay.
which you can imagine what that might do.
So you take one row and kind of copy it and make another row of it. Is
That's
that
the
it?
idea. Yep.
Okay.
And so that is an instance method that you'd call on a particular instance of a row in the database, and then but it would also create a new entry. But probably what it's doing is in the background. I haven't looked specifically, but it's almost certainly calling the create class method and passing in the data from the object. Because there would be no reason to re-implement the create method. That would be kind of silly.
Okay.
And
So
actually, let's because I think it's good to um, get rid of your fear of looking at other people's source code. So let's
okay.
actually look at the active record source code and see if we can find this method and verify what I just said. Because it's always good to verify what you're talking about. So I'm going to look for in the entire active record source. I'm going to I'm going to try to look for a method called clone because I know there is one. And we see interesting clone attributes, clone attribute value, clone with time zone conversion attribute. Interesting. So this might mean that it's done in a sort of a non-standard way. Sometimes you can define methods on the fly, and there's good reasons for that. So it may be the case that let me just look for the word clone. Excuse me. Try clone attributes, clone with time zone. Clone. Relationship is clone. Applications. Query methods. That is most interesting. Well, let's also look at the. We'll be able to find out by looking at the documentation of Active Record.
Okay.
It's always good to dig into these things and learn things. I'm always learning things like this. So active resource base, active record base. So this is, by the way, I'm going to the site apidoc.com.
Yeah.
It's a really useful site. It covers documentation for RSpec, Ruby, and Ruby on Rails. We'll probably, if we go to the site, concentrate on Ruby and Ruby on Rails. What's really neat about it is it shows you how the method has changed over time.
Oh.
So if I go to the clone method in active record base, we can see, well, first off, we can see it was there starting in version 1.0 of Active Record. And then in version 2.3.8, it looks like this was actually a common thing. Just before Rails 3, they moved a lot of methods. So let's look for, maybe they put it in active resource. Yeah, maybe active resource is a way of sort of centralizing the code for active record and maybe other things. Any active resource member, okay. So show source, clone, prefix options. Right, okay, so it's actually not calling create, and that makes sense. Because when you call clone, you're actually not saving the record to the database yet. It's giving you the option to save it or not. But first, it clones it in memory.
Okay.
And then makes it. It says, okay, now it's a new object that can be saved to the database. And so you can see here. Are you still able to see my screen?
Yeah, it's a
Small?
little hard to see the text. Yeah, a little small.
Yeah.
But
Let me see if I can. Do I have to? Oh, I had to do that here. Zoom in. This is Command plus, but my keyboard. There we go. Wonderful. So one of the other nice things about API doc, it's pretty common with source code with Ruby documentation sites, is you can look at the source code of the method right there on the page.
Nice.
And so here in the clone, we see the source code, and we can also see it's defined in the active resource gem under lib active resource base.rb. So that's great. We see a clone, and so what it's doing here is it's getting all of the attributes except for the primary key and any nested things. We don't have to worry about that too much, but basically it's collecting all of the attributes, and then it's calling self.class.new. So if this was the buzz class, we'd say this is like saying buzz.new. And the new method is like the create method, except it doesn't. I think we talked about this last week. It's like the create method, except it doesn't actually save to the database yet.
Okay.
It creates a new active record object in memory. And so you can see here we're saying self.class.new. We're setting it with an empty hash, and then we're essentially setting those attributes internally. This is instance variable set. We're setting the attributes instance variable, which is where active record stores all of its attributes internally, and then we're just returning that object from the method. And so that's, if we call clone, we're going to get an object. It's going to have all the same attributes, but it's going to be a new record.
Okay.
So we can make a tweak to one of the attributes. We can save it. We can do whatever we want to do with it. Often you'll want to make a tweak and then save it. That's usually what clone is for.
Okay.
So that's cool. We found a method. We looked at the source code of active relation in this case, and that was useful.
Right.
Right. So there's your screen. I should go up here. Okay. So class methods. I think you're starting to get that concept there of class methods and instance methods. So let me actually ask one more question, and maybe we'll dig into this application before we run out of time. I think we have some time left, but do you have some time still?
Yeah.
Great. So what would you, like, if you were to find an object in the database, would that be an instance method or a class method?
If I were to define a method? Or
if you were to define a method for active record, let's say called find, there actually is a method called find, and it finds a record by its ID, would that be an instance method or a class method?
I would guess it's a class method.
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay.
And I'm trying to think of an instance of or an example of an instance method, but that's giving it away. That's fine. I think you have the idea. So how about we try to create something new in this application? Do you? I assume you shut down your computer since the last time we worked on this.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So let's go into the command line, and we'll start up the server again so that we can do whatever we need to do. CMD, yeah. Awesome.
So is it IRB?
It looks like I'm looking at the top of your Sublime text. It's under Documents and Settings, Steve and Jess, RFS. So you can go to CD RFS. And then CD buzzer to go inside the application. And then Rails space S will start the server. And then when you've done that, when that comes up, yeah, that's coming up. So open up your browser, and we'll go to localhost.
/buzz.
Yep. That's the URL that we made for creating a buzz. So Oh, I remember we didn't talk about links last week.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of important. So let's create a link. Maybe, excuse me. Since we have another page that has all of the buzzes, what was that? BUZZS, I think.
I think so.
Well, let's see. Let's make sure that's there. Awesome. So let's go back to the buzz page, and we'll put a link in the top of the page that links to all of the buzzes.
Hmm.
So I guess I'll ask you that question. Where would we put that?
Where would we put the link?
Yeah.
Is
Where
that
would
right?
we? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So,
And feel free to look around a little bit and see if you can figure it out. If you have any questions about what you're looking at.
in this new form .html.erv.
So that's a good start. Let's try to add that at the maybe make some space at the top of the page. Cool. And I won't ask you to guess this. I don't think you've ever made a link before. Is that right?
That is a correct assumption.
Excellent. Well, we bring you an exclusive Steve's ever first link ever being created.
First link. Woo.
So it's a tag.
Just A.
Just A. It stands for anchor.
Okay.
And then there's going to be a property on it, which is href, href, and that's going to be inside the tag.
So is it A space HREF?
That's right.
Okay.
And then there's gonna be equals with a double quote inside the tag still. And you can close the tag if you want. We're gonna go inside the equals. And slash buzzes.
Like that?
That's it, yeah. And so this is going to create a link. Well, and there's going to be a little bit more, but this is going to create a link to that other page. And since we're already on localhost port 3000 /buzz, since we're putting the slash there, the slash indicates that you start over again at that first slash. And you replace everything with what you're linking to here.
Okay.
And so we're going to be on here, we're going to be on /buzz, but we're going to be going to /buzzes.
Okay.
So if we wanted to, we could put in the entire domain and say http :// localhost port 3000.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not good, because if this ever goes to a production site, if we ever have, buzzer.com, then that's no good, because inside of your code, you're linking to localhost port 3000. And
I see. Okay.
that's not going to work for anybody but you, pretty much.
Yeah, right. Okay, so this replaces the last bit that says /buzz with /buzzes.
Right.
Is that it?
That's right.
Okay.
And this is called a relative URL,
Yeah.
which is opposed to an absolute URL.
Okay.
Which is what I was talking about.
Sense.
Yeah. So in here we'd say see all buzzes or something like that. Whatever text we want to have for our link.
Do I have to have quotation marks around that?
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
And then we'll end the A tag. So the text inside of the A tag is going to be our link.
Is it like that?
That's perfect. And then save it and reload the page.
Ah.
Excellent. Now, so if you click on that, now
cool.
we've followed a link.
Ah.
So this is slightly problematic,
Hmm.
And I'll show you why. So if you go back, do you happen to remember where we define the relationship between URLs and what controllers they go to?
URLs and what controllers they go to. I do not. Was it
Let me see if you can figure it out.
the thing, or is it? No, I have no idea.
Why don't you peek through and see if you can figure out what file it is.
Was it routes?
Yep, that was routes. And so these, again, these are all references to URLs. And I think you can actually put slashes in front of these, /buzz, /createbuzz, /buzzes. And those would still point to, those still refer to the same thing. But that's what you're referring to, is the /buzzes is going to go to the buzz controller and the index action, which is just, again, in the controller terminology, an action is just a method that you've defined. So that's just how they've defined that. So let's say we want to link to buzzes. Like in here, let's say we decide to change the URL to buzzes. So change that.
Like that?
And then save. And let's go to the browser and reload the page and click on See All Buzzes. Routing error. Now you see the problem?
So, so now that buzzes doesn't exist anymore? Or it doesn't know how to route it to a URL?
Kind of both. It doesn't exist as far as Rails is concerned, because there's no longer anything defined that sends buzzes, buzzes, to the index action, or to anything, really.
Okay.
We could, if we wanted to, like if this site had been out for a while, like if thousands of people were using it, we could set up something where but buzzes redirects to buzzes.
Okay.
So if anybody has like a bookmark on the buzzes URL, we could set up that as a redirect. But no one in the world has gone to this site yet. And so, just fact of the matter. So what we need to do is we should define the link in a more generalized way so that we don't have to change this link. So if you go into what was it, new form, you can see we can easily change this to see buzzes.
Right.
But if we happen to have like 20 links all of our application to this part of our application, or if maybe we've done some meta programming and it's done in sort of a weird way, or it's just if we don't happen to catch it, then we might deploy this code to production and then a bunch of our site would break.
Okay.
And so this isn't necessarily good. So let's there's actually a way to put the URL into the href that will make it change whenever we change our route.
Okay.
So let's go to the command prompt again. And maybe go to start, and we'll open up a new command prompt. Let's actually minimize this command prompt because we just want to leave that server running all the time.
Okay.
And we'll open up a new one, and we'll go under RFS and buzzer. And so type rake space routes. What this is going to do is it's going to look at our routes.rb file, and it's going to tell us how all of our routes are sort of laid out, especially because sometimes routes can get a little more complicated than this. But you can see here, it's essentially telling you how it's doing the mapping. So you have the prefix and the verb, which you ignore for the moment. There's the URI pattern, which is like, for example, /buzz. Excuse me. /buzz goes to the buzz controller and the new form action. And each of them has a prefix that's sort of again, this is sort of convention over configuration, is based on what we've defined as the route. So /create buzz is what defines the prefix create buzz, not the buzz controller and the create action. And so we can use this prefix as a common anchor, so to speak, that we can always refer to this route by. And so that's actually maybe not true. This actually occurs to me that we would have been referring before to buzzes, buzzs, but now it's buzzes. So that's not exactly the best thing. So let's do it this way. Yeah, let's do it this way. So if we go back into new form, but this gives you an idea of sort of what's available. Get rid of the /buzzes. And so we're going to insert some dynamic content in here. So to do that, we do less than % equals, and then do a space and % greater than. So this is a little bit weird of a syntax, and we'll come up with a better one in just a minute here, but what this is doing is it's allowing us to put some Ruby code in here, which is going to insert something into our href. And so let's go back inside of that tag just after the equals and say space URL _4, and that's FOR. That would be kind of nice if it was the number 4. And then in parentheses, because this is a method that we're calling, it's a URL4 is a view helper, which is something it's in views to just make it easier for us to generate HTML and other things. So say controller : space : buzz. This is saying we want to go to the buzz controller, and then say comma, space action, : space : index. So this means whatever we're doing as far as routing goes, we want to have this link go to the buzz controller and the index action. And so it's probably not exactly clear what's going to, well, it's kind of clear what's going to go on, but so save this, and we'll go to the web page again. Reload, perfect. That's going to change the link. So if we click on that, now we're at buzzes. So the URL for knew what was in our routes file, and so it knew what URL to put there for the buzz controller and the index action. So we could change buzzes to be, foobar or whatever in the routes, and that would be that would still the URL would change inside of our link here, because we're sort of using our routes to know where we need to go in order to get to that right controller action.
Okay, so this here, it knows to find this because this part says index?
Yes, it knows. So you see buzz # index, that's a special format in the routes file which is saying buzz controller index action. And so we've made a mapping between the buzz's URL and the buzz controller index action. And so when we say URL4 and we're indicating the buzz controller and the index action, then it knows what URL it has to use, which in this case is buzzes. But if we change that URL to be something else entirely, it would change with it. You can give that a try if you want. Just change it to something that makes no sense. Yeah. Crazy stuff.
Huh.
Yeah, and a link to crazy stuff.
Magic.
Yeah.
It's all magic.
So there's actually a little bit even easier way to do this.
Okay.
Rails provides, yeah, let me change that back. Rails provides a nice way to, we'll probably want to save the routes too, so that gets updated. So Rails provides another helper. There's the URL4 helper, but there's even a helper that generates a link for us, which is even nicer. So let's use that same syntax for inserting into the document the less than %equals.
So in the same line of code here?
I just do it on line 3, right where you are.
Okay. Do I do the whole from the beginning, a tag and all that?
No, just just a less than %equals. Because what we're going to do is this is going to create an a tag for us without us having to even know what an a tag is. But it's useful to know what an a tag is because, if you're generating HTML, you sort of need to know all this stuff.
So, all right, before we go on, what you said it's an anchor tag. So what does maybe that mean?
So as far as links go, I mean the metaphor is maybe a bit strained, but it creates a link, and so like it's sort of an anchor. You're sort of anchoring one place on the web to another.
Gotcha.
Sort of one way to think about it. Another way that this can be used is when you click on a link, you go to a particular part of the page, and that to me, and actually you use a tags as to sort of anchor those parts of the page to say like, if you could label a particular part of the page to be, this is the conclusion. So you have a paper online, and you use an a tag to say, okay, this is where the conclusion is. And then you create another a tag that links to that conclusion so that your browser would scroll right to the right place. And so that to me has always seemed more like using the term anchor more appropriately. But really what's important to know is that an a tag stands for anchor, but it's generally for creating links.
Okay.
And I'm sure, clicked on lots of links on the web.
I think I've seen a couple.
Yeah. So in here, we're going to call, on line 3, we're going to call the link to method, just like we did the URL4 method.
Okay, so link _2.
And inside of that, you can actually, go ahead and do that. And the first argument to the link to method is going to be, let me verify, I think it's going to be the string. It's going to go inside of the a tag. So API doc, Ruby on Rails, link to action view helpers, link to arguments, body, and URL. Yeah. So the first so make a string that says see all buzzes.
Oh, so like that?
Exactly. So make it a capital S, just because we're going to make the same link that we did before. And then make a comma after that string. And then you can copy and paste all of that stuff from the word controller to the word action. Or sorry, to the word index. My fault.
Okay.
And then just paste it right after that comma. And then end this tag, end this sort of insertion of dynamic data with the, well, do you remember what that is? The way to do that? Yep.
Is that all I need to do?
That's all you need to do.
Okay.
and then save the page.
Now this top line, do I need to comment it out or anything?
We want to get rid of it, but let's keep it there for the moment so you can see what's being generated.
Okay.
There's a different way to make comments in HTML, which we can explore later. So now you have two links. And also keep in mind, this is another important thing about HTML, that if you don't explicitly make something have a new line, it's not going to have a new line.
Makes sense.
So you had those different links on different lines. That's why it's together here. So if
Yeah.
you go ahead.
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. So if you go to the View menu and say View Source, we'll actually look at the page that's been generated here. Is it View? Is it under Tools, maybe? Page Source. There you go. Down, it's third to the last. And so this is the page that's being generated. You can see there's a lot of stuff here that you don't even normally think about. There's some script tags and some link tags that point to CSS. But what you can see is that these two links are identical. You created one the manual way, and then you created one using the linked to helper. And the link to helper is just nicer because you don't have to type in all of those angle brackets, and you don't have to type in angle brackets in order to insert the URL for into the thing.
Yeah.
It's just cleaner.
Nice. So the little bit of code created the HTML code that we needed, basically.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there's go ahead.
Nope. I gotcha.
And actually, since we're on that, let's replace these form elements with. You can close the source of the page. Let's replace these form elements with some Rails helpers as well, because it's generally you're going to find you're having a nicer time. It's good to know the HTML that's under the covers, and it's good to type it out so you sort of are familiar with it. But the Rails helpers are often really helpful, which is why they're called helpers. So let's go back to that source.
Oh, the source, yeah.
Well, the source, close the source, but I meant the source code that we were actually editing in the editor. And so let's get rid of that first A tag because we found a superior way to do this. And we'll want to keep that HTML there so we can sort of see it, but make some space in between lines 3 and 4. And again, we're going to do a less than percent, but we're not going to do equals. And we're going to say form tag is the method we're calling.
Like that?
And let's actually, let me just show you really quickly. If you go up to the link to tag, get rid of the percentages, or the percents, or the parentheses, and the first one replace with a space, and the last one just delete. And that's also valid Ruby syntax. It's actually pretty common, especially in views. So you might want to get used to that. But you don't in Ruby. You don't usually need the parentheses. There's some cases where they become necessary, but they're not necessary here. So we're going to say form tag space. Actually, you need the equals, I think, here. Let's leave the equals there before the form tag. Sorry, I know that was confusing. And so we're essentially, again, remember, we're essentially replacing lines 7 and through 10 here with some more convenient helpers. And I believe you say space URL colon and then specify the string / create buzz like you have down below. And then after that string, comma, method, colon and then the string get. Or actually, you can use space. Maybe a better way to do it is get rid of the string and say space colon get. I think it'll take that. And this is all lowercase. This is using a symbol. Go ahead.
I was reading about this on the little bit of playing around with Ruby I did. It seemed like there was two different ways to kind of define a string. You could have it in quotes, or you could do this colon. Is that what we're doing here? And this saves memory. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So it's not technically a string. It's kind of string-like, but it's called a symbol.
Symbol, yeah.
Yeah, and that is what you're doing there. And I'm pretty sure Rails allows this for this method here. So if we say, and then we end the tag with a % greater than.
Okay.
And then make a new line, less than % equals, and then say end. We actually need to put a do at on the previous line. Say end, and then end that tag. And after the get on line 4, say space do. Before the percent, because essentially what we're calling a Ruby block here, but we're sort of inserting it into the HTML, which is sort of an interesting concept. And so then you can say, if you hit enter to make a new line, and I believe it's text. You want to make a tab, and then the less than % equals. I'm going to look up this documentation while you do that. So I'm trying to remember how to do a text area. Again, Rails. Text area tag up there. Cool. So say text underscore area underscore tag.
Like that?
And then space. Name. I'm not seeing your mouse cursor anymore. It might have frozen. Oh, no, I see your mouse. Okay, there we go. So space name, colon, with no space after the name. Yeah, perfect. Space, colon, content. So here we're replacing line 10 with a helper text area tag. And then so end that tag.
So maybe I'm a little dodgy still on. So this tag with the % symbol versus just the standard tag. So what does that do different?
So what's that's doing is it's allowing you to type in Ruby code.
Okay.
And the result that's returned out of the Ruby code is inputted into the page. And so these methods that you're calling, the link to, the form tag, the text area tag, those are methods that are provided by Rails that will return HTML for you.
So line 9 through 11, so that's just HTML that we're typing in?
Right, that's just straight up HTML that we're typing in.
And then these last lines, we're typing in Ruby stuff, and that's creating HTML for us.
Right.
Okay.
And so when we're done with this, we should see in the source of the page, we should see that these two blocks of HTML look almost identical.
Cool.
So make one more line. We're going to put that input tag in. But the method that we call is called submit tag.
Like that?
And then you specify value is the string buzz this. It's going to be a string. Yep, and then you can end that. And save it, and then we'll reload and see what it looks like. Because I very well might have gotten something wrong here.
Oh.
Good. Well, it's an error. Errors help us learn. So this is not a great error, but new form line 7. Yeah, I think this is saying that we don't want to have these equals before the end and like try getting rid of that equals before the end. Yeah. And save. Maybe also put tabs. Yeah. Put tabs before everything on lines 5 and 6. Yeah. Just because this is a block in Ruby, the do and the end sort of say that, and it's usually you indent things inside of the block.
Okay. Now that's purely for our benefit, right? It doesn't cause it to behave any differently?
No, it doesn't cause it to behave any differently.
I know in the little bit of Ruby I played around with, some of that kind of did matter, I think.
It might in some cases. I know in Python, it's really important.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Python,
that's what I meant.
yeah. That's really important in Python. Ruby, not quite so much. Oh, so that kind of worked. Value buzz this. Oh yeah, because it just the first argument is just puts in the value. So you can get rid of value colon and just pass in the string buzz this.
Like that?
No, get rid of the word value entirely. Yep, perfect. Because the submit tag is sort of smart. It knows that you generally want to specify what's the value of the submit tag. And you can specify other properties by passing in a second argument that's a hash. But this is why helpers are helpful sometimes, is because they really only ask for the most important information first, and then least important information after. And so they generally make it sort of nicer to specify this stuff.
Yeah.
So you can actually see here it's doing some things that we weren't doing. That's a little more advanced. So we messed up a little bit, but that's fine. So it's saying accept char set UTF-8. So that's nice because it just makes sure that we're working on UTF-8.
What's UTF-8?
So let's get through this, and then I'll explain encoding, because encoding is a whole subject. But I think I can just explain the basics of it briefly. Excuse me. ID, name, content, name. So we messed that up too. So let's go back to here and say put. I have to look up the form tag syntax. 1 second here. You can look over to my computer if you like. API doc. Ruby on Rails. Form tag. So URL for options, and then options. So examples are helpful. Right. Okay, so we can just specify the URL. We don't need to say URL. That's great. So again, I think it's just sort of the same thing that we were dealing with before. You can just get rid of the word URL there.
Here?
Mm-hmm. And the colon as well. And so create buzz is going to be our first argument, because forms pretty much always need an action. They probably always need an action, or at least you always generally want an action. And so you don't need to specify it as some thing. It's just like, oh, the first argument is going to be the action, because that's the most important. And then after that, there's a hash that you can specify to say what properties you want, like method get. And so this is essentially you're typing Ruby code, and it's very Ruby-like, but it's gonna translate very closely into the HTML. So go ahead and save, reload, see what that looks like. You can even, I think, reload the source page in Firefox and see, just because since we're going to view the source anyway. So if you go to the source page in the last tab there, it's just loading a little slowly for me. So yeah, can you reload this page using maybe Command R, or sorry, Control R? Yeah, there we go. Awesome. So now our action is create buzz, our method is get, that's all good. Our text area has the ID of name content. Right, so I think for text area, again, API doc. I briefly looked up text area tag, but text area tag. So yeah, name is the first thing we specify, and then we can specify an optional content that goes inside of the text area tag. So let's go back to the Sublime text. And again, it's the same error I made, where we can get rid of name and just pass in the argument content. Yeah, that's perfect. Save, reload. Yeah, perfect. And you can see it specifies this is another nice thing about the helper, is that by default, both the ID and the name are content. We talked in the second episode, I think, about HTML and how you can specify IDs for the purpose of CSS. And then for the purposes of forms, you can have a name which defines the label that the data is going to be assigned when it gets sent to the next action. And so here, the ID is content. So we could style this text area in some way by referring to it by the ID content. And all we had to do was pass in content, as the one argument, but it specifies both a name and an ID. If we wanted to, we could change the ID or get rid of it later, but it's just sort of convention over configuration wins the day. And separately, let me actually also, this form is actually looking good. I think it's doing everything that we want to do. So we close the source. And in the text area, the one thing I'll also point out is specify a second argument to the text area tag and just pass in a string of whatever you want to say.
Second argument.
So it's actually after content.
Oh.
You still there? Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, apparently with ScreenLink, we have reached the daily sharing time limit for the free account, which is 2 hours per day.
Okay.
We can continue, since this is our first time finding this out. We will continue.
Let's continue, and then we'll maybe find some other solution later.
Yep.
Or we'll limit our screencast to 2 hours, but I don't see that happening necessarily. To exactly 2 hours at least. So right, let's get rid of that quote, and after the content, pass in the other argument. There's just a string of some sort.
Wait, I'm sorry. So I added this, and then now what am I doing?
So after content, pass in another argument. So use comma, and then just define any sort of string that you want.
The normal way with quotes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There you go. And save it. We'll reload the page. And again, this is the helper is putting in, in the first argument is the ID and the name. The second argument is what goes inside of the text area by default.
Okay, so we can have a default value.
Right.
Okay.
And a lot of times we don't want a default value, and so that's why it's the second argument, not the first argument. Is because generally your required arguments come first in methods, and then optional arguments come later.
Makes sense.
And if you look at the source of the page really quickly, you'll see that the text honey is just defined in between the two text area tags. And you can see that there on line 27. Oh, maybe reload this page. Oh, no, sorry. Line 20. I was looking at the wrong line. 21. It's just in between text area and the end text area. So it's not a property. That's just how HTML is defined in the HTML specification. So
Okay.
nothing crazy about that. It's just showing how helpers can be helpful. So I think that's... Do you have any other questions? Because I don't want to cover much more than that. We could talk about UTF as well, but...
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I don't have any real questions at the moment, I don't think.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, I tried to move a little bit more slowly today when we talked about some stuff. I think that was good.
I appreciate it.
Sure. I want to help you, and I want to help anybody who might be listening. So,
Yeah.
So in brief, let's actually. I'll show you an example. So, first off, I'll show you. If you go to close this browser or this source window, and you go back into Tools and Web Developer and Network, I think is what we want in here. I'm used to Chrome, but this should work. And reload this page. And then we'll click on Buzz there. Just the first one.
Here?
Yep. And somewhere in there, I bet it's going to say UTF-8. Hopefully. It probably would be in the response headers. Maybe not. Maybe it just assumes it. So, briefly coming back to the beginning, in computer science, people are creating computers. I don't think it's in there. I think I probably am misremembering how it's defined. But people, when they're first creating computers, had this problem. How do I make characters appear on the screen? Letters, numbers, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And computers are really good at storing numbers, essentially on some sort of media, whether it's a hard drive or memory or whatever, you're storing ones and zeros. Right. And if you take different chunks of those ones and zeros, like, let's say, a set of 8 ones and zeros, that gives you the ability to store 255 combinations of things. And so, and then the eight ones and zeros, a particular 1 and 0 flipping is called a bit, and then 8 ones and zeros together, 8 bits, is called a byte.
Okay.
Sometimes people define a byte as 7 bytes or 7 bits. Sometimes people define a byte as something else. It's pretty arbitrary. It just happens that 255 is a pretty useful number of combinations that you can work with per byte.
So that's like ASCII characters, right?
Yeah, exactly. ASCII is another sort of formatting alternative to UTF-8.
Oh.
The thing is that ASCII... so ASCII is the American Standard Code for Information Interchange. There are... and I think it's also is very similar to or is the same as Latin 1, which is another... I think it's another name for it. And there's also like US something or other. There's a set of numbers that represent the specific document that specified the standard. And so essentially what this is doing is saying, like, if I store the number 55 in this byte, all I've really done is stored the number 55. But if I say that this set of bytes, that I have, let's say, 5,000 bytes that represents a text document, if I want to be able to sort of interpret that, I need to assign to each number a character. Whether it's a 1 or a Z, or it's a little tilde or an equals or a space, all these different things. You assign those to individual numbers.
Okay.
And this is what encodings are. They're a mapping between a number and something that will appear on screen to represent that number.
Cool.
And so this is how text has been stored for a long time. The problem is that America came up with its own encoding, but that didn't cover some other foreign languages that had accents, or Cyrillic was an entirely different set of characters. Japanese, of course, and Chinese are entirely different set of characters, and so it really didn't cover it. And especially like Japanese and Chinese, those aren't going to fit in 255 combinations.
Right.
And so there was this problem, and actually I think, if I understand it right, Japan, for a long time, they used the fax machine. They didn't really catch on to computers until later because of encoding issues.
Interesting.
Yeah. This is what I'm told, at least.
Yeah.
So there's this problem we have. Like, okay, the web comes. So the people have created all these computers before the web comes along, and they all have their own standards. And this computer pretty much works on this standard, and this computer works on this standard, and that's not too much of a problem. And engineers maybe were cringing because they maybe saw where this was going. But as you exchange documents with another computer, your computer might work under the assumption that it's a Russian document using a Russian standard. So let's say Cyrillic 1 or whatever. And when the document, in fact, was built under the assumption of sending it with an American or a Latin standard.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to that Russian computer, it's all it's Russian characters, but it makes no sense because it's just a set of numbers that were based on a Latin alphabet.
Yep.
So this is the sort of problem that you get when you go between encodings. And for a while there were lots of different encodings, and so on the web, this problem was kind of solved for a while by documents saying, okay, this document is in this encoding, and if you know the encoding, then you can display the right things.
Yeah.
But if you don't know what the encoding is, then you're kind of it doesn't work. And sometimes people will build a document in one encoding, and they'll put it in a file system that's going to be served up by a web server, and the web server sends it out and saying like, oh, I'm configured to send out, I'm configured to tell web browsers that I'm in this encoding. Let's say the web server is always going to send out saying this is a Latin encoding, but the document was built with a Russian encoding in mind.
Yeah.
Then that's going to mess things up. So if you put the wrong header on something, for whatever reason, it's not going to look right on the other end. So UTF-8 and more generally Unicode was built to try to solve this problem. Unicode is a framework saying, and I might get this wrong, and people can definitely comment on the YouTube channel if I am, but I did have to deal with some pretty intense encoding problems recently, so I think I might have this down. Unicode specifies a gigantic mapping of numbers to characters.
Okay.
But it's not an implementation. It's not an implementation itself. It's just a standard saying we declare that this number goes to this character, and it's an attempt to specify all of the characters everywhere. Latin characters, Japanese characters, Chinese characters, even like really weird characters. If you've seen emoji in your phone or anywhere else, those are specified in the Unicode standard, and they all have numbers associated with them. So UTF-8 I believe there's different UTF-8 the UTFs. There's the UTF-8, UTF-7, UTF-16. All have different implementation details about how they get the job done. And UTF-8 is this sort of interesting. There's like I think UTF-16, if I remember right, is like all characters are stored in 16 bytes, or they're all stored in 8 bytes, or something like that. Something's very straightforward. It's like, okay, we're just going to define. You have, or maybe it's UTF-4. You have 4 bytes, and we can fit every single character in those 4 bytes because that's 255 times 255 times 255 times 255, which is a very large number. And so we could represent every single character in that. The problem is that most of the time, especially if you're in Latin encodings, you're only using those first 255 characters, and so you're not using more than 1 byte's worth of complexity.
Gotcha.
And so there's UTF-8 has become kind of a standard, I think, in part because in some cases it's able to use 1 byte, but then it can use up to 4 bytes depending on how, what characters you're accessing. But from like 1 to 128, I think it's always using it's compatible with ASCII, I believe, entirely. And I think all of these different encodings, they were pretty much compatible for 0 through 128. But then when you went 129 through 255, sort of all bets were off.
Oh, okay.
And so with UTF-8, it's compatible with 0 through 128 or 127 maybe. And then I think there was some characters above 127. I don't know how exactly it works, but I know there's certain values that say, okay, this value indicates that there's another byte coming. And so they use sort of clever techniques to make it so that sometimes you only have to have 1 byte, sometimes you only have to have 2 bytes, but sometimes you use 3 bytes and 4 bytes. And that's all determined by the first byte and the second byte, whether they lead on to other bytes.
Yeah.
But really, at the core of it, it's just a way of figuring out whether data in your computer, which is essentially just a bunch of numbers, like what that's actually supposed to be displayed on the screen.
Okay.
So, there's a really funny image that we've been passing around at my office that it shows what happens when you have like 4 different, a certain bit of data passes through like 4 different systems and is interpreted in 4 different ways and just comes out as a big gobbledygook because, there's 4 different programs that made mistakes and just made it even more and more messed up. And it's written in a little poem format. It's really nice. I'll put a link in the YouTube description as well because I think anybody watching might enjoy that. But yeah, that's the idea of Unicode. It's a neat little thing, and the great thing about it is as long as you only ever use Unicode and specifically UTF-8, you're generally fine, and you don't have to worry about these issues. That's not entirely true, but it's a very comforting thought, and I'll end the show on that thought.
I like ending on a comforting note, right?
Yes, indeed. So, good night to everyone. Do you have anything to say to our viewers before we go?
No, just thank you again for this exciting opportunity to learn all this stuff. My brain hasn't completely melted out of my ears this time, so this is much better.
Awesome. I like to improve. Maybe you actually have some brain power to reflect on these things after the fact.
I hope so. Yeah.
Cool. So with that, we'll say goodbye, and I'll turn off the recording.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.